Perfect. The Catena of John Damascus on Paul is found in its manuscript witnesses as a series of numbered and alternating lemmata and scholia. The scholia are most often taken and adapted from Chrysostom, but some of these might be original to John Damascus. There's another source. No one's identified it yet. So it may be John Damascus himself. The commentary has been cataloged in Clavis Patrum Graecorum as number 8079, and the Catena edition is included in Parpolov's ECP.1.4 group. I'm aware of 5 unabbreviated witnesses to the edition. GA018, that's in Moscow at the State Museum, GA0150 and 0151, both on Patmos, GA1506, which is Megiste Lavra in Athos, and GA2110 in Paris. Oh. Okay, we got it. All right. There is, unfortunately, not a single place where all 5 of these manuscript witnesses are extant. 018 is Lacanos from Romans 10:17 to 1 Corinthians 6:14. GA0150 is Lacanos prior to Romans 13:5. GA1506 is Lacanos after 1 Corinthians 4:15, while GA0151 and GA2110, these are essentially complete for Paul. My doctoral research has centered on a subset of these manuscripts and on the creation of digital tools for text and manuscript studies. Now, the subset of witnesses that I've been studying are GA0150, GA2110, and GA1506, which I have named Family 0150. The family of witnesses stands apart from 018 and 051, primarily by exhibiting a non-majority text, while that of GA018 and 151 is markedly Byzantine. And this is in addition to other structural differences, including the number of columns in the manuscripts and the numbering format. For a little more information on the family, you can see the chapter that was published in the previous Colloquiums volume that has just come out. Now I turn to the question, what is the relationship of the Damascene witnesses to one another, since they are different? We have at least two groupings, it seems, and to the larger manuscript tradition. We'll attempt to answer this question and propose the stemma for the witnesses and an approximation of where they may fit into the larger textual history of the New Testament. But first, allow me to curb expectations. My detailed evidence and focus of my research is limited to Romans 13 through 1 Corinthians 4, which are the only chapters over which my family witnesses are extant. And you can see that the overlap hopefully is clear. To answer this question, what is the relationship between these witnesses concerning their lemmata, scholia, and wider tradition? I will first briefly introduce my method and tools. Then I'll present a stemma of the family with 10 or 12 other New Testament witnesses and some illustrative readings that show why the stemma is the way that it is. And third, I'll present the stemma of the same manuscripts, but based only on their scholia, so we can see how they relate to each other in both of these texts. Okay, the method I used to construct the following stemmata might be recognizable as a simplified version of the CBGM. Certainly, I did make use of an implementation of CBGM computer tools, namely the OpenCBGM software engineered by Joey McCollum. My workflow is as follows. Number 1, create complete TEI formatted transcriptions of the manuscript witnesses. And for this paper, I also transcribed the scholia. Collate these digital transcriptions and produce a TEI formatted collation file. I use ITSE's collation editor for collating the lemmata against other transcriptions, which I acquired from INTF and INGTP. And many thanks to Catherine Smith for this tool, the collation editor. But for the scholia, since there were only 4 witnesses, I collated these by hand in apparatuses, which is something I'll mention in a moment, which can export TEI collation on demand. Number 3, make textual decisions and begin setting local stemmata, consulting textual flow diagrams, and reevaluating the local stemmata. Number 4, attempt to identify potential ancestors by noting which witnesses are both closely related to the target witness and which have a majority of prior readings in comparison to the target. Finally, variation units need to be weighted so that readings which may be more connective than others can influence the relationships to a higher degree in witnesses. To support and conduct my doctoral research, I've developed and launched a web-based application for creating, visualizing, analyzing, publishing collation data. And I have named it Apparatuses because it sounds like apparatus, and dinosaurs make textual criticism seem a little more exciting. All of the collation data that I mentioned in this paper are available in full for browsing at apparatuses.io/published. There you'll find the critical apparatuses for the lemmata and the scholia, and the local stemma graphs for each variation unit. Another feature that Apparatuses provides is a fully featured user interface for Joy McCollum's implementation of the CBGM, the open CBGM. So this means that I'm able to provide pre-genealogical coherence tables for both the lemmata and the scholia, in addition to all of the other graphs associated with the CBGM. Anyone is invited to create an account and import or create their own digital critical apparatus. I first designed apparatus to import the TEI collation output of ITSE's collation editor. But it's possible now to build up one from scratch, though the happy path is to start with ITSE's collation editor. In addition to using Apparatuses to manually collate the scholia, I've also used it to set the local stemmata of both the lemmata and scholia of the Damascene catena in Romans 13 through 1 Corinthians 4. Once the relationships between readings are set, the collation can be imported into the open CBGM and used to generate the graphs and tables. Now, this simple demonstration will hopefully clarify what I mean by setting the local stemma, talking about relating the readings, the individual readings to each other in a direction. After this process is repeated on most of the variation units, we can begin to see which witnesses have more prior or posterior readings when compared with other witnesses. Most witnesses, when compared, will have both prior and posterior readings. In other words, you compare 2 witnesses, both will have readings. This one will have readings that is prior to this one. This one will have readings that are prior to this one. But I'm looking for the net relationship. Is there a strong overall picture of which one is more prior than the other? I'll attempt to answer this question and propose a stemma for the witnesses in an approximation of where they may fit into the other page. All right, I'm not done analyzing and setting the local stemmata, but I am fairly confident that further refinement will not reverse the direction of the relationships that I've detected so far. For a witness to be considered a potential ancestor of another, it must be both closely related on the whole, and it must have more prior readings. With that in mind, we'll now turn to my first proposed stemma, that of the lemmata, the biblical text of the Catena of John Damascus. I have the Catena witnesses in green. This is meant to be an approximate direction of how the lemmata of the witnesses to the Damascene Catena fit within the tradition. The comparative witnesses is too limited to say anything strongly. Because my collation includes only these dozen witnesses, the relationships outside the Damascene group, they are a glimpse of how it fits in. But the relationship between the Damascene witness to each other is well-founded. And I also acknowledge that while I am most interested in the witnesses highlighted in green, you are all looking at the ones not highlighted in green to see how I've related the famous manuscripts. Keep in mind that this only covers the material of Romans 13 through 1 Corinthians 4. And the A text in this analysis is generally the NA28. I have not set all of the local stemmata, so the A text isn't necessarily complete. I'll begin at the top and work down the graph to explain why the relationships are this way. The reason that GA0150 is connected directly to the A text is simple. GA0150 is not closely related to any of these witnesses, which also have more prior readings, except for the A text. All the witnesses closely related to GA0150 have a text that is net posterior, or they are not very related. The line connecting GA0150 and GA2110 is dotted, not because the relationship between the two is weak. Rather, these two witnesses have the best pre-genealogical coherence of any two witnesses in my collation. It is the strength with which the text of GA0150 is prior to 2110. Based on my textual decisions, GA0150 seems to contain a prior text only 3 times, while 2110 is prior only once. Otherwise, the witnesses contain the same reading, or I haven't decided on the local stemma for an instance. So there's 5 or 6 instances where I haven't decided. This first example in 1 Corinthians 1:2 reveals immediately that identifying the prior reading is difficult in the case of witnesses to an addition. On the one hand, reading B, the omission, is clearly secondary in relation to the initial text. While the reading in 0150, which is also the reading of the NA28 and the Byzantine text, belongs to the initial text, the A text in general, for the whole tradition. But it may also be the case that reading B, the omission, belongs to the initial text of the Damascene edition and then was corrected towards the popular text. Now, the accompanying scholium in all 4 witnesses to the Catena do quote this portion, and the article is omitted. In Romans 14:21, we find that GA2110 erroneously, it seems, substitutes hos for ho. We need a data object for that preposition, and we lose it in 2110. So this seems more likely to be an error. In 1 Corinthians 3:4, 2110 adds an additional contrast, it seems. Some are from Paul, but some are from Apollo, and then 2110 adds, but are you not men? And in 1 Corinthians 4:10, the change in 2110 is sensible. It can make sense, but it's best explained as a harmonization to the beginning of the lemma. In other words, the verse begins with hemes, and it simply has written hemes again. It's common in this witness that I found elsewhere as a common theme. Okay. Was I on the wrong slide before, maybe? Okay. Yeah, for time, I want to move to where 1506 is posterior. So, have I established that GA0150 is prior to 2110? It's close. Overall, the picture, especially when I look at the very minor things, GA0150 bears signs of being something like an exemplar. It's not something I want to confirm, or an older sibling, something like this. It seems to have signs of priority over 2110, but both are very similar. But the direction of relationship with 1506 and the previous two witnesses is considerably clearer. 1506 displays not only secondary readings with respect to a Damascene archetype, but is more likely to contain singular readings and scribal errors also. Okay, in Romans 13:13, we see 1506 substitutes komeis, where we would expect komois. And this is also quoted in the scholia, and in all four witnesses, including 1506, it reads komois. It seems to just be an error in 1506. I'm moving through these kind of quickly, but I want you to get the idea of why the directions, why I've set the directions in the stemma this way. Again, in Romans 14:10, this is just the classic homoteleuton. J 1506 skips from the nes and prenes to the nes and exuvenes. And Romans 15:33, the reading in 1506 adds a smoothing verb, as does 06, if not the same form. The 1506 also omits pontone and moves from the second person to the first person. And the change is sufficiently stark that it's not only a posterior reading to the Damascene archetype, but also from the majority reading. I could borrow Professor Houghton's term that this might be a post-Byzantine reading. With two witnesses to the addition of John of Damascus on both sides of this variant, 1 Corinthians 1:1, difficult decision. But the more difficult reading is the omission. However, 0150 and 2110, they are proven to have a better character than 0151 and 1506. And when it concerns the lemma, 0151 is rarely to be trusted. So I have selected reading A for the Damascene reading. Okay, 0151. I don't know if it was clear, but the reason we don't see 018 is because it simply isn't extant where these other four are extant. But 0151 and 018 are very similar. So I would expect it, if it was extant here, that this would include the character of 018. The examples that we just examined, difficult textual decisions perhaps, but it becomes even less the case with 0151. Even though 1506 seems to have a posterior reading more often, GA 051 is in a league of its own. It has a text that has been thoroughly and systematically updated to the majority text. In 1 Corinthians 13:7, we get the addition of un in 0151 along with the Byzantine text, whereas what I call family 0150, those three witnesses, 0150, 2110, and 1506, read with the Nestle Aland text here. Romans 14:3, the substitution of kai-ha for dai-ha, deha. In Romans 15:24, we get the addition of I am coming to you, going to Spain. In 1 Corinthians 2:4, GA 0151, along with the Byzantine reading, clarifies that human wisdom is in view here. In 1 Corinthians 2:11, we get the substitution of oiden for egnokin. Again, family 0150 and all these readings reads with the Nestle Aland text, well, 0151, which is I presume on the shelf in Patmos right next to 0150. First Corinthians 3:5, the reading in GA 0151 and the majority text, instead of asking what Paul and Apollos are, asks who they are, but servants. In Romans 4:13, both readings here are visually very similar. They're long words, but they share almost all the same letters. The difference is essentially du and blah. While blasphemeo was originally rooted in a religious or cultic context, it did come to be used for slander and dishonor, albeit with stronger sense than dysphemumενoi. And this may explain why both readings are early and widespread. So I think it is especially noteworthy for this study that family 0150 contains the early, perhaps the earliest reading found in a minority of witnesses. In other words, what I'm saying is both readings are ancient. Both readings go back very far. But one reading we have so far assigned to an initial text, and one became part of the Byzantine text. And here is a split also in the Damascene Catena. So based on this study, I confidently conclude that, well, I spoiled the next stemma. I do confidently conclude that GA0150, 1506, and 2110, these have a close relationship, which I do think constitute a family in the technical sense in our field. It's also clear that while 0151 contains a form of the same scholia, its lemmata have been systematically edited to conform to the majority text. And this raises the question, is it also true in the scholia? Were the scholia updated? Is the question I'm asking. Yes, but to a lesser degree. The biblical text in 0151, it is nearly as starkly different from family 0150 as the Textus Receptus from Westcott Hort. But the scholia in 0151 are more similar to what we find in the other three witnesses, but there is evidence of smoothing and cleaning up in just this witness that there isn't evidence of in the others. This graph depicts relationships of the witnesses considering only their scholia, not their lemmata. The label that accompanies each edge, each arrow, shows the number of prior readings and the total number of extant variation units. So note that the scholia in GA0150 and 2110 are marked as equivalent. I have not set the local stemmata in all, but in most of the variation units, and so far, there is no strong evidence to suggest that one has the prior scholia over the other. Though I do find minor hints that may indicate that 0150 has the edge, such as its tendency to use full spellings for words abbreviated in the other witnesses. For example, in Romans 13:8, 0150 reads metera in full, and the others treat it as a nomen sacrum. And the mother in question here, remember, now we're talking about scholia. This is not biblical text that we're in now. This is a scholia, and the mother is the mother of good, or the mother of virtue. This is a pattern that also holds true for the lemmata. We see 0150 is hesitant to use abbreviations where the other witnesses are happy to. A minor thing. So looking at the relationships then of both 0150 and 2110 being prior to 1506. Again, in Romans 13:8, see a somewhat lengthy omission here from the scholium in 1506. And in the scholium that accompanies Romans 14:1 through 2, these Greek letters are the numbers that do accompany the scholia. Here in Romans 15:16, most of the witnesses mention the souls of those being taught, but 1506 expands it to the souls of the righteous, or even those being taught. Okay, here we have another quite lengthy omission by. This is now we've moved to 0151. I mean, there's not very much difference in 1506, just enough to give you the sense that it is posterior to the other two. But in 051, we see a long omission here. In 14:4, we see a slight change, and moving quickly for time. Here we have the scholium that accompanies Romans 14:23, the doxology, and the first 7 verses of chapter 15 in Romans. Family 0150 unanimously says, This one from the same scholia. It says, not only was the son despised, with huios spelled in full, all family members do that, but in 0151, it substitutes the nomen sacrum Christ instead. Not only was Christ despised. Context makes it clear that huion is referring to Jesus, but GA 0151 makes that explicit, as we would expect somebody with kind of Byzantine mindset to do. So anyway, another omission. So what we find when examining the scholia in these manuscript witnesses is that their texts follow the same pattern as the lemmata. GA 0150 and 2110 are nearly identical. 1506 is very similar, but net posterior. And 0151 is, by comparison, demonstrably different, having some outside influence. In the case of the lemmata, the outside influence is obvious. It's the majority text. But what about the scholia? Is it simply the same kind of editorial smoothing, the kind that led to the majority text? I've barely mentioned GO18 because it doesn't overlap with the other four, but it is similar elsewhere in 0151. What can we say then about the Catena edition by John Damascus? Both its lemmata and scholia are best preserved in family 0150. It is also evident that GA 0151 and 18 demonstrate that around the 9th century, some communities did edit their texts in order to bring them into conformity with a standard. And in the case of the scholia, maybe the conformity of style was also valued, because in 0151, we see far more correct spellings as we would understand them. Spelling has been somewhat standardized. According to Caldwell, a family is one in which an archetype can be reconstructed from the children using the genealogical method. And in family 0150, I do think that we have all that is needed to access both the biblical and commentary text of John Damascus.
Thank you, David, for your paper. We don't have time for questions after this paper, so please write yours down and discuss them with David during coffee, or send emails if you're joining us online. We'll move to our